If you're planning to save the company by putting my name on whatever comes next, Dad, tell me before you do it again." My father stopped breathing for a second, while Nathan kept his eyes on the dining table, and the roast chicken cooled beneath the yellow kitchen light. I had come home expecting an argument about 2 missed vendor payments, not a lawyer carrying a default notice showing Carter Construction owed Cross Holdings more than $4 million. The notice did not say Damian could simply seize our company overnight. It said the final cure period expired at 9 the next morning, after which Cross could seek control of secured assets and ask a judge for a receiver. That was frightening enough, but the document beneath it was worse, because it showed nearly $700,000 in payments approved with credentials belonging to me. Before I could ask how my login had reached accounts I had never seen, Damian looked across the table and said, "I don't think you took the money, Emily, but somebody expected me to." Until that moment, Damian had seemed almost secondary to the paperwork, although nobody in Chicago would have described him that way outside our kitchen. Cross Holdings owned warehouses, trucking contracts, construction debt, and enough distressed real estate that newspapers used polite words, while people in certain neighborhoods used older ones. His grandfather had built the family business beside men whose names still appeared in federal archives, and although Damian operated through corporations and attorneys, the reputation around him had never become entirely respectable. He arrived with 1 lawyer, no bodyguards inside the house, and none of the theatrical menace Nathan had apparently expected. He simply knew our debt, our collateral, and our deadlines better than anyone at our table, which was a more convincing form of power than shouting would have been. Dad rubbed both hands over his face before admitting the failed development project had been bleeding cash for 18 months, while he kept telling me delayed receivables were the problem. He had borrowed against equipment, then against future contracts, and eventually accepted bridge financing arranged through Cross Holdings because another lender had withdrawn. Nathan had known most of it, which explained why he had spent months telling me not to worry whenever numbers stopped matching the stories I was given. When Damian's attorney explained that restructuring remained possible only if Cross could determine where the missing funds had gone, Dad made the mistake that changed how I heard every word afterward. "Emily understands the books better than anyone," he said, glancing at Damian instead of me. "So let her work with you until we straighten this out." I asked whether he had discussed that idea with Nathan before I arrived, and neither man answered quickly enough to protect himself. Dad tried to explain that he meant accounting work, not anything personal, yet desperation had stripped courtesy from his language before I walked into the room. "If that's what it takes, take her until the debt is settled," he said, and Nathan remained silent beside him, as though silence did not count as participation. My stomach turned, not because I believed Damian could legally accept a human being against corporate debt, but because my father had reached for my labor without asking whether it was his to offer. Damian closed the folder and told him, with almost clinical irritation, "Your daughter is not collateral, and I'm not taking anybody anywhere." Then his attorney slid the transaction history toward me, and embarrassment became fear because the credentials were unmistakably mine. My employee number appeared beside payments to temporary labor companies, consulting vendors, and equipment brokers I had never approved, with amounts carefully kept below Carter's secondary review thresholds. Nathan told me to calm down, which was enough to make me notice something I might otherwise have missed. He looked nervous about the documents, but not surprised they existed. I asked whether he had seen them before, and he said no too quickly, while Dad stared at the folder like it contained something alive. Damian did not accuse either man, although his attention moved between them with the patience of someone waiting for a bad story to collapse under its own weight. I told Damian to call the police if he believed someone had stolen money, and his lawyer explained that outside forensic counsel had already preserved Cross servers and notified the company's insurer. "Reporting would follow the evidence," she said, "but confronting possible participants before imaging devices and securing records could cause data to disappear or witnesses to coordinate explanations." Damian wanted someone who knew Carter's payroll habits to sit with the forensic team that evening, because his auditors could identify anomalies but not explain why certain vendor codes looked almost legitimate. I agreed on 3 conditions. We worked at the law firm, my own attorney reviewed anything I signed, and nobody treated my cooperation as payment toward my father's debt. Damian nodded without bargaining, while Nathan immediately objected to me leaving with him. That was when I knew my brother was afraid of more than losing Carter Construction, because 30 seconds earlier, he had allowed Dad to volunteer my future without saying a word. I put on my coat, called an attorney I trusted from a former vendor dispute, and told Nathan he did not get to discover concern only after I started making decisions he could not control. Dad followed me into the hallway and whispered that everything he had done was meant to keep our grandfather's company alive, as though survival automatically made any method honorable. I wanted to tell him I understood, because understanding had always been the fastest way to end conflict in our family. Instead, I asked the question neither he nor Nathan answered before the front door closed behind me. If somebody used my credentials, which one of you gave them access? At the law office overlooking Wacker Drive, the forensic accountant did not ask me to trust Damian. She asked me to describe how Carter Construction actually processed payroll. That distinction helped, because trust felt useless when the evidence had already shown what trust had purchased inside my own family. We worked from read-only copies of preserved records, while my attorney joined by video, and nobody allowed me to alter original files or wander through systems the way amateur investigations happen in bad television. The first hour produced nothing dramatic, only hundreds of ordinary transactions, employee batches, vendor invoices, and temporary labor payments that looked boring enough to be safe. Then I found a vendor code beginning with a prefix Carter had stopped using 3 years earlier, after I changed how field labor accounts were created. Whoever built the false account knew our old habits, but had copied them from somewhere rather than understanding why they had changed. The forensic accountant marked the entry and asked me to keep going without telling her what I expected to find, which prevented my suspicion from becoming the investigation. 6 more vendors carried variations of the same obsolete pattern, and each had received payments below the level that triggered review by our outside controller. The amounts were not identical, the dates were irregular, and several legitimate invoices had been placed between them, suggesting somebody understood how auditors recognized repetition. When we traced registration information, one company listed a North Halsted address I had visited twice because Nathan claimed a college friend owned the condo. He had actually lived there for almost a year, although he told Dad he was staying with me whenever questions about rent or money became uncomfortable. Damian watched the accountants build the timeline without trying to run the room, yet his stillness changed when the first Cross Holdings release code appeared beside one of the payments. Nathan could have misused my Carter credentials, but he could not have invented an internal cross-approval sequence or known which dollar amounts avoided an enhanced compliance review. The forensic team traced additional releases to finance authority groups rather than individual names, which meant the records suggested insider help without proving who provided it. I asked Damian who could access those groups, and he gave the answer I respected because it was inconvenient for him. Senior finance officers, 2 compliance administrators, and his own executive office. "So your people are in this," I said, and he replied that the records made that possible, not proven. Near midnight, one of the accountants found something more useful than a suspicious name, an administrative reset tied to the first month my credentials were abused. Carter's software vendor had received a request claiming I had replaced my authentication device, after which a temporary bypass permitted access without my normal second-factor approval. The request originated from Nathan's company email, but the phone verification had been accepted through a callback number belonging to a Cross Finance office. I stared at the record until the letters blurred, because Nathan had not guessed my password in a desperate moment. Somebody had deliberately created a second doorway into my account. Damian asked whether my brother could have known the authentication process, and I told him Nathan barely remembered his own passwords unless someone wrote them down for him. The forensic accountant recommended stopping until the provider could preserve call recordings and support logs, yet I wanted to confront Nathan immediately because anger made waiting feel like cowardice. Damian said a confrontation before preservation could warn whoever had coached him, and I accused him of trying to control the pace because control was the language he spoke most fluently. He did not deny that description, which was irritating, but he asked what meeting arrangement would allow me to choose without damaging the evidence. We agreed on the following morning at my attorney's office after the software provider confirmed preservation, with Nathan invited through counsel rather than ambushed. Damian would attend because Cross funds were involved, but he agreed to sit back unless his company's evidence required clarification. Before we stopped, the team searched approval records attached to the Halsted vendor and found the same senior identifier appearing near several disputed releases. The identifier belonged to Victor Hale, Cross Holdings' chief financial officer, although the records still did not establish whether he personally authorized each payment or supervised a group that did. Damian stared at the name for several seconds before telling the forensic accountant to preserve Victor's mailbox, device backups, and access logs through outside counsel without alerting internal staff. There was no threatening phone call, no order to send men somewhere, only a legal hold and a request that Victor's administrative privileges be quietly limited before business opened. Watching Damian use procedure instead of reputation made him more interesting and, in some ways, more dangerous, because he seemed perfectly comfortable waiting for proof. Nathan answered my call shortly after midnight and sounded exhausted before I told him why I was calling. I gave him the address of my attorney's office and asked him to bring his personal laptop, any messages involving cross-financing, and every document connected to temporary vendors during the previous 2 years. He tried to ask whether Damian would be there, then changed the question when he realized I was not asking permission from anyone. "Emily, there are things you don't understand," he said, and the fear behind the sentence sounded older than tonight. I told him that was exactly why he needed to come, because by morning, I intended to understand enough that nobody could hide behind protecting me again. After I hung up, Damian asked whether Nathan sounded surprised by Victor's name, and I realized I had never mentioned Victor at all. Nathan arrived at 10 wearing yesterday's shirt beneath a clean jacket, carrying his laptop and the expression he used when a client discovered a problem before he had prepared an explanation. My attorney sat beside me, the forensic accountant joined by secure video, and Damian took a chair at the far end of the conference table without being asked twice. I placed copies of the credential reset, Halstead registration, and cross-release records in front of Nathan, then asked him to explain the financing from the first conversation forward. He looked at Damian when he saw Victor's identifier, which answered one question before his mouth did. After several failed starts, he admitted meeting Victor at a contractor dinner 14 months earlier, when Carter was weeks from missing payroll and Dad refused to consider bankruptcy protection. Victor offered what he described as short-term vendor financing through companies already approved by Cross, allowing Carter to receive working capital without reopening the entire loan agreement. The first transactions genuinely covered supplier invoices, which made the arrangement feel unconventional rather than criminal, while Nathan convinced himself he had found the clever solution Dad needed. 2 months later, Victor suggested routing certain advances through temporary labor accounts, explaining that Cross's internal limits made direct lending slower and more expensive. Nathan knew that explanation sounded wrong, yet he had already benefited from the earlier transfers and feared that questioning the structure would cause Victor to withdraw everything. He gave Victor access to Carter payroll data and initiated the authentication reset under my account because my approval authority was higher than his. I asked whether he understood that he was using my identity, and Nathan said he expected the account to be restored before anything reached an audit. "That isn't an answer," I told him, because intention had become the family's favorite substitute for consequence. He finally admitted that he knew my name would appear on internal records, but Victor assured him the entries were temporary placeholders that would later be reconciled. Some money paid legitimate Carter obligations, while other transfers moved onward to vendors Nathan did not control, and at least one transaction produced a consulting payment that covered Nathan's personal credit card debt. He had not designed the scheme, but he had crossed enough lines willingly that pretending he was only a victim would have been another lie. The part that hurt came after the facts, when Nathan leaned toward me and proposed the same family solution wearing cleaner language. If I told investigators Dad had verbally authorized me to create emergency vendor accounts, Nathan believed we could frame the irregularities as poor controls rather than deliberate credential theft. He said I had no record, understood accounting, and handled pressure better, as though my ability to survive damage made me the logical place to put it. For a moment, I saw the brother who taught me to ride a bicycle after Mom died, and loving that version of him almost made the present version easier to excuse. Then I understood that affection did not become meaningless when someone betrayed you, but neither did betrayal become harmless because affection survived. I told Nathan I would not lie, accept responsibility, or help him negotiate consequences away before we understood what they were. His face tightened, and he said he had been trying to save a company employing more than 100 people, which was true enough to make his choices harder rather than easier. Good motives had gotten him through the first bad decision. Fear had carried him through the next 50. When my attorney asked who else knew my credentials were being used, Nathan hesitated long enough that I knew another answer was coming. Dad had learned 6 months earlier after a payroll report reached him during my vacation, and instead of telling me, he ordered Nathan to fix it quietly before Emily gets dragged into this. At 11:42, my attorney received notice that 2 Carter vendor accounts had been frozen by their banks after suspicious activity reviews triggered by inquiries from Cross's outside counsel. Minutes later, a supplier called Dad demanding assurances, and another client paused new work after receiving an anonymous message claiming Carter was about to collapse. Nobody threatened me, and nothing exploded, yet the timing showed someone outside our conference room knew scrutiny had started. Damian wanted me to relocate temporarily and route communications through counsel until his security team understood whether the leak came from Victor or someone else. When he said he would arrange the apartment, phone protocol, and transportation, I heard the same mistake in different clothing. I told him I would stay wherever I chose, keep my own phone, and follow security recommendations only after someone explained the actual risk instead of converting concern into orders. Damian's jaw tightened because agreement did not come naturally to him when he believed danger was involved, but he did something Dad and Nathan had repeatedly failed to do. He asked the security consultant to brief me directly, then let me decide between my apartment, a hotel booked through counsel, or staying with a friend whose address was not connected to Carter records. I chose the hotel, accepted a driver because my name had appeared in fraudulent accounts, and refused Damian's suggestion that every call pass through his staff. He disliked the compromise openly, yet he accepted it, and that mattered more than any polished speech could have. Before we left, Nathan told me Victor had started asking questions about my schedule several weeks earlier, including whether I still reviewed payroll remotely on Thursdays. The detail matched transaction times we had already identified, which meant Victor was not merely approving irregular payments after Nathan submitted them. Somebody had been choosing moments when my legitimate activity could make false logins look ordinary. Damian asked Nathan to preserve every message and stop contacting Victor, while my attorney warned him that deleting anything now could create an additional problem no cooperation agreement could erase. As I gathered my papers, Nathan whispered that Dad had known more than he first admitted, and I realized the next conversation might cost me something the fraud itself had not yet touched. Dad came to the law office the next morning, carrying the scarred leather briefcase he had owned since I was a child, and seeing it hurt more than I expected. That case had been beside him at school conferences, hospital visits, loan closings, and every construction bid he once described as proof that honest work eventually became something solid. He sat across from me with Nathan 2 chairs away and began explaining the failed development until I stopped him because the hidden loan was no longer the question. I wanted to know when he learned my account had been used, what he did afterward, and whether he had ever considered telling me before consequences forced honesty. Dad looked at Nathan once, then finally understood I would not allow them to answer as a team. He knew 6 months ago, after an unusually large labor reconciliation appeared while I was visiting a job site in Wisconsin and could not have approved it from our office. Nathan confessed enough to frighten him, but blamed Victor for the structure, promising the accounts would be corrected once Carter secured a pending municipal contract. Dad chose silence because exposing Nathan risked the company, while exposing Victor risked the bridge financing they still believed they needed. He told himself I was safer not knowing because I had not created the fraud, and he assumed a future correction would remove my name before anyone noticed. I asked what he planned to do if the correction never came, and his eyes lowered because there had never been a plan beyond surviving another month. Then he said I had always been the strong one, and the phrase landed differently now that I understood what our family had built around it. After Mom died, Nathan was allowed to fall apart because everyone expected me to keep moving. While Dad praised my maturity each time I absorbed another responsibility nobody discussed beforehand. When Dad had heart surgery, I handled household accounts. When Nathan lost a client, I rebuilt schedules. When payroll failed, I stayed late because people depended on us. None of those choices had felt abusive in isolation, and some were choices I would still make because families do carry one another through difficult seasons. The damage came from everyone quietly assuming my capacity belonged to them once they had witnessed it. I asked Dad why the burden had always moved toward me, and after a long silence he gave an answer too ordinary to hate easily. "Because you stayed," he said, then corrected himself before I could respond. "And because I got used to believing you always would." He did not cry or ask me to forgive him. He looked like a man realizing that love had allowed him to become careless with the person most willing to offer it. My attorney redirected us toward decisions rather than confession, because emotion could not repair corporate governance or protect my financial interests. That was when we discussed the 22% of Carter Construction my grandfather had placed in my name. The previous version of me might have surrendered those shares simply to prove I was finished, but anger is a poor substitute for financial planning. Instead, counsel proposed placing my voting rights into an independent trust during the restructuring, followed by a professional valuation that would let me sell some or all of my interest without gifting away years of value. I resigned from payroll authority immediately, demanded written indemnification for liabilities created without my consent, and authorized outside accountants to complete the forensic review. Dad would no longer be able to use my ownership as a reason I had to remain operationally available, while I would not punish my future self for mistakes other people made. Leaving the family role did not require leaving money on the table to make the gesture dramatic. The investigation moved more slowly than my emotions wanted, which was probably why it remained credible. Cross placed Victor on administrative leave after outside counsel preserved his devices and identified conflicts involving shell vendors, while federal investigators received the evidence through formal referral rather than Damian deciding guilt himself. Software provider recordings confirmed a Cross-Finance employee had authenticated my reset after speaking with someone using information from Nathan's request. Bank records later showed 2 shell companies shared a registered agent connected to Victor's brother-in-law, while encrypted messages recovered from Nathan's backup contained Victor's warnings about review thresholds and my work schedule. Each fact had existed before we understood it, which made the eventual picture feel less like a twist than something slowly coming into focus. 2 weeks later, Damian asked me to meet at Cross Holdings with my attorney present because his restructuring team had completed an initial proposal for Carter. He could seek liquidation under the secured debt, but the analysis showed equipment sales and broken contracts would probably return less than keeping the company operating under strict controls. The proposal removed Dad from day-to-day financial authority, barred Nathan from company accounts, installed an independent controller, and tied repayment to cash flow rather than pretending $4 million could disappear through generosity. I read every page looking for the favor that would make me owe Damian something personally. There was none, and when I asked whether he had softened the terms because of me, his answer was simple enough to believe, "I noticed what it would cost you, but the numbers still had to work without you." Carter accepted the restructuring 3 days later because the alternative was a receivership fight the company could not afford, and Dad signed the documents without asking me to intervene. That mattered more than any apology he had offered, because consequences finally remained where they belonged instead of traveling toward the person most likely to carry them quietly. Nathan entered a cooperation agreement through his own attorney and began providing records related to Victor, although nobody promised cooperation would erase his responsibility for credential misuse or false documents. Damian did not bargain on his behalf, and I stopped trying to imagine what punishment would feel emotionally satisfying. Accountability was less cinematic than revenge, but it had the advantage of being real. My own clearance arrived in pieces rather than one dramatic letter, which made the process easier to trust. The forensic report documented that the disputed logins relied on an unauthorized authentication reset, while metadata placed my legitimate device elsewhere during several approvals. Cross-counsel confirmed in writing that the company was not pursuing me personally, and Carter's insurer accepted the unauthorized access findings, subject to the remaining investigation. My attorney warned me that investigators could still interview me because evidence of innocence does not make a witness disappear from a case. I appreciated her refusing to promise certainty, especially after spending years around people who lied whenever certainty was what I wanted. Working beside Damian became harder once the emergency faded, because attraction had room to become noticeable when fear stopped occupying every available space. He never touched me casually, never appeared at the hotel without asking, and never used information from security updates to manufacture intimacy. That restraint did not turn him into a gentleman. He remained impatient, private, and capable of making an executive twice his age revise an entire presentation with one quiet question. Sometimes I disliked him, which was reassuring because fascination without irritation would have felt suspiciously like fantasy. What held my attention was not that he became softer around me, but that he became more deliberate whenever his power could distort my ability to choose. One evening after the final forensic handoff, he asked what I planned to do once Carter no longer needed my help. I told him I was leaving the company after my ownership valuation, because I wanted to know whether competence could belong to me instead of functioning as emergency equipment for my family. Damian offered introductions to several firms, and I declined because even useful generosity would make my next chapter feel connected to his influence. He accepted the refusal without pretending not to be disappointed, then asked whether I would have dinner with him after the debt restructuring, employment issues, and investigation no longer created obligations between us. I wanted to say yes immediately, which was why I told him not yet. 6 months earlier, I would have believed refusing something I wanted made no sense, but I had begun understanding how often urgency had controlled my decisions. I needed an apartment my father had never paid for, clients Damian had never introduced, and mornings when nobody's crisis determined whether I ate breakfast. Damian listened without arguing that independence could coexist with him, although both of us knew that was probably true. "Then build it," he said, and the line was not profound enough to sound rehearsed. He walked me to the elevator, asked me to let him know when the valuation closed, and did not create another reason for me to return. My shares sold gradually through an independent process, with a small portion retained as a passive investment under the new governance structure. The proceeds were less than Dad once claimed the company was worth, and more than I would have accepted if I had surrendered everything while angry. I rented a modest office in River North, and started consulting for family-owned businesses whose controls usually depended too heavily on trust, habit, or one exhausted employee everyone considered indispensable. The first 2 months were uncomfortable enough to cure any romantic idea I had about entrepreneurship, because clients paid late and health insurance cost more than I remembered. By month 4, I had 3 steady accounts and a part-time analyst named Priya who corrected my spreadsheets without asking whether my feelings were prepared. Dad called every Sunday, but our conversations changed because I stopped solving problems merely because he described them near me. Sometimes he caught himself halfway through asking what he should do and said, almost painfully, "Never mind, I'll handle it," which became more meaningful than repeated apologies. Nathan moved to Milwaukee after his attorney advised distance from Carter's operations, taking a project management job where he had no authority over company money. We spoke twice a month, occasionally laughing before remembering there were subjects neither of us could touch without care. Trust did not return as forgiveness. It returned through boring evidence that people could behave differently after nobody was watching closely. Victor's case remained unresolved when the federal indictment became public, which disappointed anyone expecting a villain to disappear neatly by the final chapter. The charges described wire fraud, conspiracy, and falsified vendor records, while his attorneys denied parts of the government's case and prepared to fight others. Damian never told me what punishment he wanted, and I never asked whether men from his family's older world had suggested different solutions. What mattered was that he had chosen evidence, lawyers, and public consequences when private power would have been easier to romanticize. By then, I had stopped seeing restraint as the absence of strength. Sometimes it was the hardest form of strength to recognize. The afternoon Damian finally appeared at my office. Rain had been falling since lunch, and Priya had already left after announcing that anyone scheduling Friday meetings deserved whatever happened to them. I looked up expecting a courier and found Damian standing in the doorway with damp shoulders, no attorney behind him, and no folder large enough to threaten anyone's solvency. He waited until I invited him inside before sitting, which was such a small courtesy that the woman I had been 6 months earlier might never have noticed it. On my desk sat a framed copy of the first invoice a client paid without knowing my father, Damian, or Carter Construction. Damian looked at it, then at me and said, "You did what you said you were going to do." I asked whether that surprised him, and he said people usually surprised him more by abandoning difficult plans than completing them. He had changed too, although not into the polished redemption fantasy I might once have expected from a man with his reputation. Cross Holdings now required dual authorization for high-risk vendor changes, while Damian had created an independent compliance committee whose existence irritated him almost daily. He still spoke too little when angry, and became controlling when he believed time was running out, according to people who apparently felt safer correcting him now. "That sounds unbearable," I said, and he replied, "I'm told growth often is." He placed a plain white envelope on my desk, and my body reacted before my mind did, because envelopes from Damian had once carried consequences large enough to redraw my family. Inside was nothing except a reservation for two at an Italian restaurant near the river, scheduled for 7:30 under both our first names. I stared at him and asked why a dinner invitation required stationery when normal people had phones. Damian admitted 3 different people had advised him that flowers might feel excessive, and showing up with jewelry would get him thrown out of my office. I laughed harder than the joke deserved, mostly because the most feared man I knew had apparently convened an informal committee to determine how not to pressure me. Before answering, I asked the questions that would have sounded ridiculous to anyone who had not lived through the previous year. Dinner involved no Carter business, no cross-consulting opportunity, no discussion I was professionally required to hear, and no decision that changed if I declined. Damian answered each question without irritation, then told me the reservation could become a table for one without creating another conversation about why I had said no. Months earlier, his silences had felt like rooms where everyone else was expected to adjust. Now he allowed silence to remain empty long enough for me to decide what I actually wanted inside it. I told him that the night we met, my father had tried to turn my competence into something transferable because desperation had convinced him usefulness and ownership were almost the same thing. Damian had been the one person in that house with enough power to exploit the confusion, while family loyalty, financial pressure, and fear all pushed me toward agreement. "You could have made cooperation feel compulsory without ever locking a door," I said, and he understood exactly what I meant. He had not always handled the days afterward perfectly, especially when fear made him start issuing safety instructions like orders. What mattered was that when I objected, he eventually learned the difference between reducing risk and replacing someone else's judgment with his own. Damian did not tell me he had changed because of love, and I was grateful because human beings rarely become healthier through one elegant explanation. He said losing Victor had forced him to reconsider systems built around personal loyalty, while watching my family collapse under unspoken obligations showed him another version of the same mistake. People needed boundaries not because trust was worthless, but because even decent people behaved badly when affection became permission. I had learned something similar from the opposite direction. Being dependable did not obligate me to remain endlessly available. We had reached the same lesson from different sides of power. I stood, reached for my coat, and told Damian dinner sounded good, although I reserved the right to hate the restaurant if the pasta was disappointing. He smiled. Not the rare, dramatic smile romance novels usually reward themselves with, but the quick, crooked one I had seen whenever something escaped his control without causing disaster. We rode the elevator downstairs while discussing Priya's theory that every wealthy executive needed one employee whose job description included saying no. Outside, Damian opened his umbrella and paused rather than automatically pulling me beneath it. I stepped closer because the rain was cold, and because choosing shelter is different from being placed there. Halfway to the restaurant, our hands brushed, and he left his beside him instead of closing it around mine. I thought about Dad learning to call without asking for rescue, Nathan rebuilding a life where consequences could no longer be outsourced, and Carter employees keeping their jobs without anyone pretending the company had survived unchanged. I thought about Victor awaiting trial, because some endings remain unfinished long after the emotional story has reached its answer. Then I reached for Damian's hand myself, feeling no debt, no contract, and no family expectation hiding inside the gesture. For most of my life, I had believed love was proven by how much you were willing to carry for someone. I finally understood it could also be measured by what they refused to place on your shoulders.